Let's talk about Blood Omen, Legacy of Kain. Ouch. Hello everyone, this asthmatic who knows way too much about games is back with a vengeance to talk about Blood Omen, Legacy of Kain. Not to be confused with Legacy of Kain Blood Omen, which is not a thing, despite later games in the criminally underrated Legacy of Kain series following that naming scheme. Except Blood Omen 2. We'll get to Blood Omen 2. Blood Omen is a top-down 2D Zelda-style game where you control the nobleman Kain, who is slain by these shit-tier bandits when a tavern owner didn't allow him to stay the night. Kain wakes up in the realm of the necromancer Mortanius, who not only has a badass name, but offers him a chance at revenge by turning him into a vampire and letting him loose on the countryside. This is a game with incredibly detailed world building and complex lore that can be uncovered through the game's many cutscenes and FMV sequences. So while I will be talking about Blood Omen's writing and plots, I'm going to avoid entering into major spoiler territory beyond the basic premise of the game, because I would highly recommend you play it for yourself to experience the story in full. Before we actually start the game, however, we need to get it up and running. Since Blood Omen is the first game in the series and was developed by Silicon Knights, whereas the later games in the series were developed by Crystal Dynamics, this game is unfortunately not on GOG or Steam due to our great nation's intellectual property laws, and can only be purchased digitally on the PSN store, or via a physical copy for the PlayStation 1 or the PC if you're cool with the idea of spending upwards of $30 for a 25-year-old game. What you're looking at right now is the PC version of the game, but running a mod called Varrock's GL Wrapper and Patch. It basically touches up on a lot of the game's features and increases the overall quality of the sound and FMV sequences, and gives this game proper Xbox One controller support. Installing it is as easy as running the setup file. Blood Omen's prologue is interesting, because this introductory FMV scene shows an event that you won't know the relevance of until a bit later in the story. Just know that it's perfectly fine to be a little confused, because this game's story is kind of dense, and the world of Nosgoth's lore is a lot more complex than the standard fantasy setting. But it all gets tied together in the end, and you'll see why this game series was so groundbreaking for its time. What I find interesting about this intro is how subversive it is. Players back then were conditioned to being a stalwart fantasy hero striving to restore the balance of the world. So you might be led into thinking that you play as this illustrious paladin, but no, he immediately gets captured and cursed to possess this suit of armor, so he can't experience the pleasures of the flesh anymore. Then you're greeted with the actual main character, Kain. He's a wealthy nobleman with a very ornate way of speaking.
And so I left, cold of heart and soul, forced to the road and the long, bitter night.
If you were playing this on release, you'd immediately realize that he's not quite like the other characters you've played before, even before he becomes a vampire. He comes off as a bit of an arrogant prick, and the first thing you do upon taking control of him is go outside and get ganked by the aforementioned shitty bandits. Again, as I mentioned before, Kain becomes a vampire and is let loose to seek revenge and essentially do the necromancer Mortanius' bidding. This is when he really comes into his own, because vampirism gave him a new perspective of the world. Something I want to highlight regarding Kain's character is that he screams Ve Victus almost every time he gets into melee combat.
Ve Victus!
Was his gift a curse?
Ve Victus!
I would seek the pillars.
Ve Victus! Ve Victus!
Well, I looked that phrase up, and it's Latin for woe to the vanquished. If that doesn't sum up Kain's personality perfectly, I don't know what does. I mentioned before that he was extremely arrogant in life, and in death he's no different. He's what I'd consider an extremely compelling anti-hero, because he doesn't make any attempt to rationalize what he does, but he still has his motives and his own character arc that allows the player to sympathize with him. His story starts out as him looking for revenge, but he gets over that when he massacres the bandits with little ceremony and instead wants to search for a cure for his curse, and cleanse the pillars of Nosgoth by killing their corrupted human guardians. Throughout his journey, his cynicism gets deeper and his hatred for humanity festers when he sees the oppression that his fellow vampires have been subjected to for millennia, and that the human protectors of the pillars of Nosgoth failed in their duties due to their own very human faults, and that the so-called righteous folk are no better than the bloodthirsty vampires they hunt. After that, I can't really blame this guy for thinking most humans are evil hypocrites and they'd be better off under his iron fist. To put it in a more modern perspective, if you've taken one look at Twitter, aka the festering dick cheese of humanity, you'd probably sympathize with him as well. The Legacy of Kain series has some of the best voice acting and writing I've had the pleasure of experiencing. I don't mean it was just really good for the time it was made either. It's some of the best, period. Even though the older hardware of the time makes it sound like the acting is delivered through a walkie-talkie, you can still feel the range of emotions delivered by these actors, including Simon Templeman's buttery smooth voiceover for Kain. Not only does he narrate what's going on, he also reads out the item and spell descriptions in a way that's informative but artistic at the same time.
The world had changed to my eyes. I had not expected such cruelty from the light. For in the embrace of the sun I could find no comfort, only malice. This would change in time for the worse. These curious devices hurl bolts of whirling energy and eviscerate my human enemies by stripping ragged flesh from blood-stained bone.
However, there are some fairly repetitive voiced lines. Some of them are endearing, like Ve Victus, but the others are kind of annoying, like this.
Oh, please, help me, kind sir! Oh, please, help me, kind sir!
This guy is still calling Kain kind sir, even though he saw him chug down his friend's blood like it was Kool-Aid. The writers also were not afraid to tread into more mature themes for this game, extending beyond a simple story with a clear good guy, bad guy, and a moral. There really is no moral of the story. It's a cynical look at just how corrupt the world of Nosgoth really is. There is no good and evil, only winners and losers. The game's story is told through Kain's campaign of carnage. He wreaks havoc on the kingdom like a 5-pack of those Korean spicy noodles wreaks havoc on my asshole. The gameplay really makes it satisfying to lay waste to your enemies and leave a trail of destruction in your wake. However, I have a few things to make abundantly clear before diving into the finer points of the gameplay. Blood Omen is a top-down 2D action-adventure game. Its darker aesthetic might lead one to believe that it's similar to Diablo, or games like Diablo, but that's not necessarily true. This game is actually very similar to The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. This also means that the best way to play this is not with a keyboard, but with a controller in my opinion. It's still more than playable with a keyboard, but I personally thought the game felt much more comfortable to play with my Xbox One controller. The melee combat system is very simple. You swing your weapon and it hits the enemy in front of you. However, it is very janky. The most dangerous enemies are the ones who can get inside of you. And no, I don't mean that in a philosophical or a sexual sense. Since there's no collision detection for sprites, enemies can burrow up your ass and you can't hit them, nor can they hit you. Usually this happens when they swarm you, leading to you trying to navigate out of the enemy while getting railed by 50 other guys at once. There are also no invincibility frames that kick in after you've been hit, so you can get knocked back and damaged again immediately by spikes, a trap, or another enemy attack. This also happens when you walk into traps, leading to instant death after being juggled from one murder tile to the next, but it's much worse when being hit by enemies. The only time you have iframes is when you die and get revived by the Heart of Darkness. You're also not guaranteed to hit someone even if you see your sword give them a nice iron kiss, which in my eyes is the final straw that makes the melee combat feel awful, and encourages you to do what I consider to be the main attraction of the gameplay: abusing the magic system. At some point you get this wonderful little spell called Deflect. At first I thought this was just a spell to deflect and/or block magical attacks, but I was wrong. This broken spell absorbs all enemy damage, all damage from traps, and deflects all magic attacks. There are certain things that you're not immune to when the shield is active, such as lava, water, or spikes, but this is still an extremely powerful spell. Combine this with the spike armor that allows you to deal damage back at enemies when they hit you, and you have a winning combination. There are some other pretty cool spells too, but these are more situational, such as Mind Control, which allows you to control a human to pull a lever or something else that's out of reach. Or Lightning Bolts, which is usually just for pushing buttons that are also out of reach. Though you can abuse the magic system, there are times when melee combat is absolutely necessary, such as when you run out of mana or when you have to fight Bane the Druid, who doesn't care about your little shield and will just charge right through it. As a vampire, you also need to do what vampires do best, which is suck blood. You're going to need this ability to regenerate your health because enemies hit you pretty hard and your life slowly drains away during the daylight hours. You can only suck blood from people or creatures that are stunned, and the best weapon for stunning is the Morning Star. It doesn't deal as much damage, but it stuns enemies much more quickly, allowing you to suck them dry with less hassle. The spike armor does a good job at stunning human enemies as well, but it's advisable to only rely on that if you have the deflect spell activated. There's also a spell that allows you to suck blood from range, but that one takes a ton of mana to use, and I usually just use it in emergencies. Speaking of the spiked mace, there are also some melee weapons I really enjoy using, despite the crappy melee combat, such as the dual-wield axes and the flame sword. The flame sword is just this sword that does more damage and burns enemies out of existence, which is handy for regenerating enemies because you can't get back up if you've been vaporized. The dual-wield axes are definitely my favorite weapon because you can do this really awesome spin attack that just destroys everything, and your attack speed is much higher. But it's hard to trigger the special attacks without it getting cancelled by a stray arrow, and you can't use magic while wielding them, so I just use them when I run out of mana. There's also the Soul Reaver. I'm not a fan of the Soul Reaver, but I can see why some people would be. It's a giant, two-handed flamberge that insta-kills any non-boss enemy. You can't use magic with it either, and it consumes mana when used, so I just stuck with the tried and true Flame Sword and Deflect combo, with the occasional appearance of the dual-wield axes. While Blood Omen Legacy of Kain is Zelda-like, it's a lot more linear than a Zelda game would be. This is neither an objectively good nor bad thing. Some people like the more open-ended and exploratory nature of Zelda, whereas others prefer a more guided, narrative-driven experience. I happen to fall into the latter category, though I do like to explore and go off the beaten path at times. Luckily, Blood Omen has that too. You'll find lots of different usable items for Kain to employ against enemies, which are all useful in their own way. My personal favorite is this spinning blade. You see, Kain doesn't believe in frivolous 20th century ideals like human rights or dignity. So to trigger the libtards in the Geneva Convention, he uses a device that spins at very fast speeds and rapidly tears the skin off of any human it comes into contact with. There are also other consumables, like these worms that melt any living thing that is unfortunate enough to get in their way, but that's just one example of many. Though you unlock certain previously locked areas in the earlier stages, I only really went back a handful of times to hit up the Pillars of Nosgoth, and to find more Hearts of Darkness, because I died a lot in the beginning and kept running out of them due to my early ineptitude at using the Deflect spell. I would also occasionally go back to a more populated town with fewer guards, just to fill up on blood before entering a more dangerous dungeon. The game really wasn't designed for much backtracking, but like I said before, that's okay. You're still going to be whisked through lots of unique environments and dungeons, and it definitely feels like an adventure through the entire kingdom, culminating in one epic battle where you casually walk forward and suck the occasional blood while people are murdering each other. One last thing before we wrap up. The user interface is not that great. While I do enjoy Kain's item descriptions, they're not the issue here. Neither is the equipment system, though I do wish there was a way to quickly switch melee weapons on the fly. The issue is specifically the inventory menu and the spell and item slots. You can only slot up to 4 spells and items on your person for quick access using the right bumper for spells and the right trigger for items. That means if you want to cast a spell or use an item that isn't in one of your quick access slots, you have to go back into the menu and replace it with a spell or item that's already there. This can be really tedious, and there's no real strategic slant to this, because accessing your item slots pauses the game in the same way going into your inventory would. There's really no reason why all of the items aren't just there for you to use in a big grid that you can rearrange in the menus. Blood Omen Legacy of Kain is a worthwhile game to play if you can track down a copy. Though it has a lot of issues that makes the combat feel janky, the joy of exploration, Kain's progression as a character, and the well-written story alone should make this a title that stands the test of time. If you enjoy action-adventure games like Zelda, then I'd recommend you download it and give it a try. I'd also recommend it for people who enjoy becoming super overpowered towards the end of a game, kind of like in Gothic. I'll be covering the other games in this series in due time, so stay tuned for when those come out. Thanks for watching, and please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Creamy out.